The flash of white paper against the blue fabric of the American uniform caught Takashi Matsumoto's eye first, not the image itself. He stood at rigid attention, his body still trained to show no reaction, even after weeks in the camp. The guard, a young man from Wisconsin named Miller, had been pacing the fence line as usual that April morning in 1944. But today, something was different. Instead of the customary silence or occasional barked order, Miller approached the wire, hesitated, then withdrew a creased photograph from his breast pocket. He held it up like an offering across the divide between captor and captive. "My family," Miller said, tapping the photograph with his index finger. "Madison, Wisconsin." Takashi stared, his face a mask of practiced indifference that concealed the storm beneath. The faces in the photograph were ordinary enough. A smiling woman holding a small child, an older couple who must be parents, a farmhouse visible in the background. But it was the casual sharing of this intimate fragment that shattered everything Takashi thought he knew about his American captors. In the Imperial Japanese Army, such personal details were never shared, especially not with the enemy. Photographs were treasures kept hidden, protected, sacred. Yet here was this American guard, offering a glimpse of his most vulnerable connections to a man he had been trained to see as less than human. "Wife," Miller continued, pointing to the woman. "Son, 3 years old." The words hung in the air between them, simple and devastating. Takashi felt the eyes of his fellow prisoners watching from the barracks, their collective breath held. Would he accept this strange breach of the natural order between prisoner and guard? In that suspended moment, everything he had been told about Americans, that they were barbaric, uncultured beasts who would torture and kill without hesitation, collided with the simple humanity of a young father proudly displaying his family. What strange land had they entered, where enemies showed photographs instead of bayonets? What would come next in this upside-down world where captors treated the captured not as vermin, but as men worthy of conversation? And perhaps most troubling of all, how could Takashi reconcile what he had been taught with what he was now experiencing firsthand? The sky above Camp Livingston, Louisiana, stretched endless and alien to men who had grown up beneath the mountains of Honshu or the dense urban sprawl of Tokyo. Morning roll call had ended, and the prisoners stood in loose clusters in the yard, their thin cotton uniforms already damp with the unfamiliar southern humidity. Lieutenant Hiroshi Nakamura watched as the newer arrivals flinched at every sudden movement from the guards, their bodies tensed for the beatings and torture they had been promised would come. "They are waiting until we trust them," whispered Corporal Tanaka, a hardened veteran who had surrendered only after being wounded and unconscious during the fighting on Guadalcanal. "This kindness is a mask. The Americans will show their true nature soon enough." But weeks had passed, and the expected cruelty had not materialized. Instead, the prisoners had been processed efficiently, given medical treatment for wounds and illnesses, assigned clean barracks with actual beds, and fed portions that seemed impossibly generous. The contrast with what propaganda had prepared them for was so stark that many simply could not accept it. "My brother was captured by the Chinese in '37, another prisoner murmured. "They skinned him alive. We received his uniform with the letter telling us this." "The Americans must be planning something worse to make us drop our guard." Lieutenant Nakamura nodded silently, but doubt had begun to creep into his mind. The night before, he had witnessed a scene that defied explanation. A young guard named Thompson had been assigned to night patrol. Around midnight, he had approached the barracks window where several prisoners sat playing a makeshift game of shogi with pieces carved from spare wood. Instead of ordering them to bed, Thompson had watched curiously, then retrieved something from his pocket. A photograph of himself in a baseball uniform. "You play games. I play baseball," he had said, pointing to himself in the picture where he stood with a bat resting on his shoulder. The prisoners had stared at the photograph, then at the guard, their faces unreadable. Thompson had seemed disappointed by their lack of response, But before leaving, he had placed a small packet of American cigarettes on the windowsill, an offering that violated everything the prisoners understood about the relationship between captor and captive. Now, as the morning heat intensified, Lieutenant Nakamura watched as Miller approached once more, this time with several photographs. He stopped near a group of prisoners who were digging drainage ditches and, astonishingly, began showing the pictures around. Not demanding anything in return, not mocking or threatening, simply sharing glimpses of his life before the war. What could possibly be their purpose? Sergeant Watanabe muttered beside Nakamura. Is it a psychological tactic? Are they documenting who shows interest to identify the weakest among us? Nakamura had no answer, only the growing sense that they had entered a reality that operated by rules completely foreign to everything they had been taught. The guards did not behave as enemies should. They maintained discipline, but showed none of the vicious cruelty that had been promised. They shared food and photographs, as if the wire between them was merely an inconvenience, not the division between opposing worlds. As the day progressed, Nakamura noticed something even more disturbing. Some of the prisoners who had been in camp longest were beginning to respond to these overtures. A few had even retrieved carefully preserved family photographs of their own, kept hidden against regulations, and were cautiously showing them to guards who expressed interest. This exchange, this humanizing act, threatened something fundamental about how they had been trained to see the conflict. And what would happen when these men returned home, if they returned home, carrying the knowledge that their enemy had treated them with unexpected humanity? How could they reconcile what they had experienced with what their nation had told them to believe? The question lingered, unanswered, as the Louisiana sun climbed higher in the alien sky. The photograph trembled slightly in Private Kenji Sato's hands as he withdrew it from the secret compartment he had sewn into the lining of his uniform jacket. 3 months in American captivity, and he had not shown it to anyone, not fellow prisoners, certainly not guards. The image was precious beyond measure. His young wife, Akiko, holding their infant daughter, a child he had seen only once before being deployed. He had carried this forbidden treasure through the hell of Guadalcanal, through surrender and the long journey across the Pacific, guarding it more carefully than his own life. Yet here he stood, in the shadowed space between barracks, contemplating something that felt like betrayal. The guard Peterson had approached him that morning during work detail, a dog-eared photograph extended across the invisible barrier of rank and nation. "My kids," Peterson had said simply, pointing to 2 young boys in school uniforms. Then, with a gesture that required no translation, he had mimicked asking if Sato had family too. Now, heart-pounding, Sato weighed the unimaginable. To share this most intimate possession with the enemy, it violated everything he had been taught about protecting his family's honor, about maintaining the barrier between himself and his captors. Yet something about the genuine interest in Peterson's eyes, the complete absence of mockery or cruelty, made him hesitate. "What are you doing?" Lieutenant Nakamura's voice cut through Sato's thoughts like a blade. The officer's face was rigid with disapproval. "The guard, he showed me his children." Sato stumbled over the explanation, suddenly aware of how it sounded. "He asked if I had family." "And you would share your wife's image with a barbarian?" Nakamura's voice dropped lower. "Have you forgotten what these men would do to our women and children if they reached our shores? Have you forgotten your duty as a husband and father to protect them, even from foreign eyes?" Shame flooded Sato's face. He quickly returned the photograph to its hiding place, bowing slightly in deference to the officer. But later, alone on his bunk, the moment replayed in his mind. Peterson hadn't seemed like a barbarian as he'd proudly pointed to his sons. He had seemed like a father, no different from Sato himself. The realization was as unsettling as the humid Louisiana air that clung to his skin at night, so unlike the dry chill of Tokyo winters. Across the camp, other exchanges were occurring with increasing frequency. Sergeant Miller, who worked in the camp kitchen, had begun a collection of states, photographs of prisoners' home prefectures matched with pictures of American states. The wall behind his station now featured images of Mount Fuji alongside the Rocky Mountains, Tokyo next to Chicago, rural rice paddies beside Iowa cornfields. Prisoners who initially passed by with averted eyes now paused, some even pointing to indicate where they were from. The camp commander had noticed these interactions with mixed feelings. Captain Harrison had fought in the Pacific and had seen the brutality of the Japanese military firsthand. He had lost men at Bataan and knew of the atrocities committed against American prisoners. Yet he also understood the value of humanization, that photographs created connections that might make the camp more manageable, less prone to resistance or escape attempts. "I don't object to the photo sharing," he told his officers during a staff meeting, "but monitor it closely. Make sure nothing sensitive appears in the background of our boys' pictures. And watch for any signs they're gathering intelligence." What none of them fully grasped was the profound disorientation these simple exchanges created for the Japanese prisoners. The sound of laughter near the fence, where a guard showed a group of prisoners his wedding picture. The gentle handling of precious family images passed carefully back and forth. The sight of Americans pointing to children, wives, parents with evident pride and love. These moments created hairline fractures in a worldview that had defined the Americans as savage, inhuman enemies. One evening, as the camp quieted, a prisoner named Tanaka approached Lieutenant Nakamura with troubled eyes. "Sir," he said softly, "the guard Jennings showed me his hometown today. It looks like Kamakura, where my grandparents live. The same hills, a similar shrine." I found myself telling him about New Year celebrations there. The confession hung in the air between them, heavy with implications neither man wanted to examine too closely. For if their enemies were men with hometowns like Kamakura, with New Year celebrations and grandparents and shrines, then what exactly were they fighting for? What separated the us from them in this war that had consumed the world? The Louisiana night pressed close around the barracks, thick with questions that would continue to unfold in unexpected ways. And in the darkness, the images of distant families watched over both captives and captors alike, bearing silent witness to a strange new territory neither side had been prepared to navigate. "Show me again your daughter," the guard Miller said, his pronunciation of the English careful and deliberate so the prisoner might understand. It was their fourth such exchange in 2 weeks, and Private Hiroshi Tanaka no longer felt his heart race when withdrawing the small, worn photograph from its hiding place. The initial shame of these interactions had faded, replaced by something more complex. A quiet recognition, perhaps, that fatherhood transcended the arbitrary boundaries of war. Tanaka held up the image of 5-year-old Yumiko in her best kimono, taken the day before he'd deployed. Miller nodded appreciatively, then pointed to the child's elaborate obi sash. "Pretty," he said, then showed his own daughter's birthday dress, a frilly white creation with ribbons. Special day clothes. The simple observation that both American and Japanese fathers treasured images of their children in ceremonial clothing struck Tanaka with unexpected force. He had been raised on stories of American barbarism, tales of blue-eyed devils who would stop at nothing to destroy the Japanese spirit. Yet here was Miller, his eyes indeed blue, pointing out the similarity between their daughter's special occasion clothes with genuine interest. "Your daughter," Tanaka managed in broken English, gesturing to the guard's photograph, "very beautiful." Miller's face brightened at the compliment, and he nodded his thanks. The moment passed quickly. Another guard approached on rounds, and Miller tucked away his photograph with practiced ease, resuming his official posture. But something had shifted between them, something neither man could have articulated fully. These exchanges were happening throughout the camp now, creating ripples of confusion and reassessment among the prisoners. Sergeant Yamamoto, who had fought fiercely in the Philippines before being captured, found himself particularly troubled after Guard Roberts showed him photographs of his Japanese-American neighbors in California. "They lived next door for 15 years, Roberts had explained through a translator. "Good people. Sent to camps now. Wrong, I think." Yamamoto had stared at the image of the smiling Japanese family standing beside Robert's parents in a California garden, unable to reconcile this evidence of pre-war coexistence with the narrative of inevitable conflict between East and West that had been drilled into him since childhood. "It disturbs me," he confessed to fellow prisoner Corporal Matsuda as they worked in the camp laundry, "to see Japanese faces smiling beside Americans, growing gardens together. If such peace was possible before, why fight now? Matsuda shook his head sharply. Propaganda, obviously. They show us these images to weaken our resolve, to make us question our loyalty. But I saw no deception in Robert's eyes when he spoke of his neighbors being sent to camps. He seemed genuinely troubled by it. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of new laundry, but the question lingered. Throughout the camp, similar discussions were taking place in hushed tones. Some prisoners dismissed the photographs as meaningless, others as cunning psychological warfare. But for many, the simple humanizing effect of seeing their captors as sons, fathers, and brothers rather than faceless enemies created a cognitive dissonance that could not be easily resolved. Even Lieutenant Nakamura, the most resistant to fraternization, found himself affected when Guard Simmons shared a photograph of his brother, who had been killed at Guadalcanal. The image showed a young man not much different from the lieutenant's own younger brother. The same earnest expression, the same proud military bearing. Nakamura had said nothing, maintained his disciplined facade, but that night he had dreamed of both young men standing together in a field. Neither in uniform, neither enemy nor ally, simply two brothers who might have been friends in another time. "What purposes do photographs serve in war?" he wrote in the journal he kept hidden beneath his mattress. "To remind us of what we fight for, or to remind us of our shared humanity? And which reminder serves the emperor better?" The question had no easy answer, but it continued to unfold in every new image shared across the lines that were supposed to divide them absolutely. And as summer deepened over Camp Livingston, the collection of these moments accumulated, each one a small but significant challenge to the narrative both sides had carried into battle. The camp library, a modest room with 3 bookshelves and a table, became the unofficial hub for what the Americans now called the Photograph Club. Each Sunday afternoon, guards off duty would gather with a rotating group of prisoners who had earned good behavior privileges. The pretense of language exchange provided cover for what had evolved into a ritual of sharing. Images passed carefully hand to hand, accompanied by simple words in English or Japanese, occasional laughter, and the universal language of pointing and nodding. Sergeant James Miller, who had initiated that first exchange months ago, now served as the unofficial curator of these gatherings. He had persuaded the camp commander that the sessions improved morale and encouraged cooperation among the prisoners, arguments that Captain Harrison found persuasive enough to allow the practice to continue under loose supervision. What Miller didn't fully articulate was how profoundly these exchanges had affected him personally. Before the war, he had absorbed the same propaganda as most Americans, caricatures of Japanese soldiers as fanatical, inhuman enemies who fought with savage cruelty and preferred death to surrender. His first weeks guarding the camp had been tense, his hand never far from his sidearm, expecting resistance or suicide attempts at any moment. But the photographs had changed everything. It was impossible to reconcile the cruel stereotypes with the sight of Private Tanaka's eyes softening as he showed the picture of his daughter, or the careful, almost reverent way Corporal Matsuda handled the image of his parents' farm near Kyoto. These were not the actions of mindless fanatics, but of homesick young men who, like Miller himself, carried pieces of their hearts in creased, worn photographs. The scale of this unauthorized humanization became clear one afternoon in late summer when Miller arrived at the library to find an impromptu exhibition arranged on the back wall. Someone, prisoners and guards working together apparently, had created a display mapping the hometowns of everyone involved in the sessions. Tiny photographs or drawings of Tokyo, Osaka, Kobe, and dozens of smaller Japanese towns were pinned alongside images of Chicago, New York, rural Wisconsin, and Texas ranches. Red string connected some of the locations, indicating places where prisoners and guards had found unexpected similarities. A note beneath a pairing of fishing villages, one Japanese, one from the coast of Maine, read simply, "Same boats, same nets." Another, connecting mountain regions, noted, "Snow in winter, flowers in spring." The simple observations stripped away political boundaries, reducing geography to its essential shared features. Captain Harrison arrived while Miller was studying the display. The commander stood silently for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "They did this on their own?" he finally asked. Miller nodded. "Yes, sir. It started with just a few pictures, and then, well, they kept finding connections." Harrison rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "Connections. It seems to help with compliance, sir. The prisoners involved in these exchanges are consistently the least problematic. No escape attempts, no resistance to work details." The captain continued staring at the improvised map. "My father fought in the Great War," he said quietly. "Told me once that the Christmas truce of 1914 was the most dangerous moment of the entire conflict, not because anyone was firing, but because for a few hours, German and British troops remembered they were men first, soldiers second. Said the generals were terrified it would spread." Miller waited, uncertain where the commander was heading with this observation. "Make sure it stays contained to approved sessions," Harrison finally said. "I don't want guards sharing photographs during regular duties or security checkpoints. Keep it to the library and authorized recreation periods." "Yes, sir," Miller responded, relieved the practice would continue. As the commander turned to leave, he paused, his eyes still on the map of connected places. "The hell of it is," he said, almost to himself, "I can see my own hometown up there. Looks a lot like that place in Hokkaido, doesn't it?" Without waiting for a response, he walked away, leaving Miller to contemplate how far these ripples of recognition might ultimately reach. How many connections could form before something fundamental changed in how these men, on both sides of the wire, understood the conflict that had brought them together? The autumn of 1944 brought change to Camp Livingston. News of Allied advances in the Pacific filtered through official channels, creating currents of tension among the Japanese prisoners. Some withdrew from the photograph exchanges, retreating into silence and rigid formality. Others seemed to participate with greater urgency, as if these human connections might somehow survive whatever came next. Private Kenji Sato noticed the shift during a Sunday session in the library. The guard Peterson, who had shown him pictures of his sons months earlier, now brought a new photograph, his eldest boy in a junior ROTC uniform, looking proud and painfully young. "Wants to fight when he's old enough," Peterson explained, his expression complicated. "Thinks all Japanese are evil. I've tried telling him about you folks, that you're just men like me, but," he trailed off, shrugging helplessly. Sato studied the boy's face, seeing the same determination he remembered in his own brother's eyes when he enlisted. The cycle continuing, generation after generation. He wondered if his own daughter, who had been an infant when he last saw her, would grow up hating Americans with the same unquestioning certainty. "Your son," he said carefully in his improving English, "good boy, loyal, like Japanese sons." Peterson nodded, his throat working as he swallowed whatever emotion had risen there. "That's just it, isn't it? Good boys on both sides, doing what they're told is right." The observation hung in the air between them, too honest to be dismissed, too complicated to be resolved in this small room, far from the centers of power where such decisions were made. Across the library, Lieutenant Nakamura sat with Sergeant Miller, their conversation unusually frank. News had reached the camp of fierce fighting in the Philippines, of Japanese soldiers choosing suicide over surrender, of civilians doing the same on islands where American forces advanced. "You must think us savages," Nakamura said, quietly, "for choosing death over the shame of capture." Miller considered this, turning his coffee cup slowly between his palms. "I don't understand it," he admitted, "but I've been thinking. If you'd all been told we'd torture you, kill you slowly, dishonor you, well, I might choose a quick death too." Nakamura's eyes widened slightly at this acknowledgement. He hesitated, then withdrew a photograph he had never shared before, himself as a university student in Tokyo, wearing Western clothes, standing with an American exchange professor. "I studied English literature," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Hemingway, Faulkner. I had American friends. I knew you were not monsters. But when war came," he shook his head, "it became necessary to believe what we were told." Miller nodded slowly, understanding something profound about how war transformed societies, how it required the dehumanization of the enemy to function. Yet here they sat, sharing coffee and photographs, the careful machinery of hatred temporarily suspended. Later that evening, as prisoners returned to their barracks, Corporal Matsuda approached Sato with a troubled expression. "This sharing of pictures," he said in low Japanese, "it makes things difficult. When I see their families, their hometowns that look like ours, I remember they are men. But when I hear what our people suffer under their bombs, I must hate them again." He looked genuinely distressed. How do we hold both truths at once? Sato had no answer. The same question haunted his own thoughts as he lay awake each night. The faces in the photographs, smiling American children, wives, parents, refused to align with the demonic images of propaganda. Yet the war continued, brutal and real. Americans killing Japanese, Japanese killing Americans, regardless of how many family photographs crossed the boundaries between them. What meaning could be found in these small moments of recognition when the machinery of war ground forward regardless? What purpose did it serve to see the humanity in men you might still be ordered to kill if circumstances changed? The questions multiplied without answer as the season turned and a strange, uneasy peace continued within the confines of Camp Livingston. As winter descended on Louisiana, bringing a damp chill that penetrated the barracks, Camp Livingston prepared for Christmas. For the American guards, it was a time of heightened homesickness, their thoughts constantly with distant families gathering around trees and dinner tables without them. For the Japanese prisoners, the unfamiliar holiday highlighted their displacement, emphasizing how far they were from everything they knew. In this atmosphere of shared melancholy, the photograph exchanges took on new significance. Guard Thompson organized a special session on Christmas Eve, obtaining permission to use the camp's mess hall instead of the smaller library. Nearly 30 prisoners and a dozen off-duty guards attended, the largest such gathering to date. The centerpiece was unexpected, a projection screen and a small film projector borrowed from the officers' entertainment supplies. Thompson had arranged something unprecedented, a showing of home movies. Small reels of 8mm film from guards' personal collections spliced together into a single presentation. As the lights dimmed and the projector whirred to life, the mess hall fell silent. On the screen, jerky black and white images appeared. An American suburban street, children riding bicycles, a woman tending a garden. A birthday party with candles being blown out, a Thanksgiving dinner with a family seated around a laden table. Christmas mornings from previous years, children in pajamas excitedly opening gifts. The guards watched with naked longing, some wiping eyes surreptitiously. But it was the prisoners' reactions that proved most revealing. They sat transfixed, witnessing intimate glimpses of everyday American life. Not the decadent, chaotic America of propaganda, but ordinary moments of family joy, celebrations, routines. The America of backyard barbecues and Sunday drives, of fishing trips and school graduations. Private Tanaka watched as a sequence showed a family picnic at a lake somewhere in the Midwest. Children splashed in the shallows while adults set up food on blankets, exactly as his own family had done at Lake Biwa before the war. The universality of the scene, parents watching proudly as children played, grandparents sitting in the shade, young couples stealing affectionate moments, struck him with physical force. Had they truly been convinced that Americans lacked such basic human connections, that they were somehow fundamentally different in their loves and celebrations? When the lights came back on, the room remained silent for several long moments. Then Thompson stood, his voice slightly hoarse with emotion. "This is what we're all missing," he said simply. "This is what we all want to get back to." The statement required no translation. Every man in the room, regardless of uniform or language, understood precisely what he meant. For all their differences, for all the barriers of culture and ideology, they shared this most basic desire to return to the families and moments captured in photographs and films, to step back into the lives that waited, paused but not abandoned, across oceans and years. What followed was extraordinary. One by one, Japanese prisoners began approaching guards, not with photographs but with requests. Could they write more detailed letters home? Could censorship be relaxed enough to share that they were being treated humanely? Could they send small drawings to children who might be forgetting their faces? The questions poured out, evidence of the dam that had broken within them. Captain Harrison, who had observed the film showing from the back of the room, found himself faced with decisions that went beyond military regulations. These were matters of humanity, of fathers separated from children, husbands from wives.
日本ハイコマンドは10日ファミリー、サレンダー小銃はトレーターとして、ネバーリターン、メニー・ワイブズ、ハズバンズのフォトグラフスフロムファミリーオルターズと言って、相当 G と取り切り出せよと言われた。I'll see what can be arranged. Harrison finally said, his voice gruff but not unkind. We have to work within regulations, but I'll see. As the gathering dispersed, Lieutenant Nakamura approached Miller with an unprecedented request. If possible, he said formally, I would like to send a photograph of myself, showing I am alive and well, to my parents in Kyoto. They may believe me dead or dishonored. Miller nodded, understanding the significance of this request from a man who had most strongly resisted the humanizing effects of the photograph exchanges. I'll speak to the captain, he promised.
We might be able to arrange it through the Red Cross. That night, as snowflakes drifted across the Louisiana camp, a rare sight this far south, the barracks buzzed with subdued conversation. Something fundamental had shifted. The photographs and films had accomplished what no propaganda could undo. They had reminded every man, guard and prisoner alike, of the world that existed beyond war. A world of birthdays and picnics, gardens and bicycles, waiting for them if they survived. I had forgotten, Corporal Matsuda admitted quietly to his bunkmates, what children's laughter sounds like. Seeing those American children playing, it brought back my nephew's voice. Around him, heads nodded in understanding. For years, they had been told that this conflict was between fundamentally different species of humanity, that no common ground existed. Yet the evidence of their eyes and hearts told a different story. The photographs had built a bridge neither side had anticipated, revealing the shared architecture of human love, grief, and hope that no ideology could fully erase. As 1944 drew to a close, the men of Camp Livingston, both those who guarded and those who were guarded, carried these realizations within them like small flames against the darkness of continued war. And though none could know what the new year would bring, something had been irrevocably changed by these exchanges of paper and celluloid across the artificial divisions of conflict. What began with a single photograph shared across barbed wire had grown into something neither side could have predicted, a quiet insurrection of recognition that challenged the very foundations of how enemies are created and sustained. And in this recognition lay the seeds of something that might, in time, prove stronger than the forces that had set them against each other. Spring 1945 arrived with news of Germany's imminent defeat and increasingly desperate Japanese resistance in the Pacific. The atmosphere at Camp Livingston grew tense as reports filtered in of kamikaze attacks and civilians committing suicide rather than surrender to American forces on Okinawa. The photographs continued to circulate, but now they carried a more complicated weight, evidence of what might be lost, or already had been lost, in the brutal final chapters of the war. Sergeant Miller found Private Tanaka alone one evening, staring at his daughter's photograph with an expression of such profound grief that it stopped the guard in his tracks. "Tanaka?" he asked quietly. "What's wrong?" The prisoner looked up, his eyes hollow. "Tokyo burning," he said simply. "Firebombs. My family. There." The news of massive incendiary raids had reached the camp that week. Entire neighborhoods of Japan's cities reduced to ash, civilians caught in the inferno. Miller had seen the same reports, had even heard some guards celebrating the destruction visited upon the enemy homeland. But standing before Tanaka, seeing the anguish in the face of a father who didn't know if his daughter still lived, such abstractions crumbled. "I'm sorry," Miller said inadequately. "The Red Cross, maybe they can find out." Tanaka shook his head slightly. Communications had broken down as Japan's infrastructure collapsed. No news would come until the war ended, if then. He continued staring at the photograph, his thumb tracing the outline of his daughter's face. She has your eyes, Miller offered, the observation startling them both with its intimacy. After months of exchanges, he knew Tanaka's features almost as well as he knew those of his own buddies. A ghost of a smile touched Tanaka's lips. Her mother's spirit, though.
The moment passed between them, fragile and profound, a connection that acknowledged the horror unfolding thousands of miles away, while affirming that here, in this small space between guard tower and barbed wire, another kind of understanding existed. Throughout the camp, similar scenes played out. Lieutenant Nakamura, whose photograph had been sent to his family through the Red Cross months earlier, now helped other prisoners compose letters home, working within censorship restrictions to convey both their survival and their hopes for reunion. The official military interpreter had begun to defer to him for complex translations, recognizing the lieutenant's skill with English literature that he had initially concealed. Captain Harrison, observing these developments with mixed emotions, confided to his executive officer, "I never expected to feel this way, but I find myself hoping their families are safe.
Men I would have shot without hesitation 2 years ago, I now worry about their children in Tokyo." His executive officer nodded slowly. The photographs did that. Hard to think of them as just Japs when you've seen their kids' birthday pictures. The casual racial slur sounded hollow now, inadequate to describe men whose lives they had come to know through countless shared images. Even the most hardened guards had stopped using such terms, referring instead to prisoners by name, Tanaka, Matsuda, Nakamura, acknowledging their individuality in a way that would have seemed impossible in the early days of the camp. In July, as news arrived of the first atomic bombing of Hiroshima, the mood in Camp Livingston darkened further. Japanese prisoners gathered in tight groups, their faces ashen as translators explained the reports of a single bomb destroying an entire city. Some wept openly, abandoning the stoicism that had been their shield. Others sat in stunned silence, unable to comprehend what this meant for their homeland and families. The guards, equally sobered by the implications of this new weapon, responded with unprecedented sensitivity. Extra paper was distributed so prisoners could write additional letters for the Red Cross. The camp kitchen prepared traditional Japanese dishes as best they could with available ingredients, a gesture of sympathy that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. And the photographs continued to move between them, now imbued with new urgency and meaning. Guard Roberts approached Sergeant Yamamoto with a small album he had assembled, images of Japanese-American friends from California, their gardens, their homes before evacuation to internment camps. "I want you to know," Roberts said carefully, "not all Americans supported what happened to them.
And not all Americans celebrate what's happening to your cities now." Yamamoto accepted the album with a formal bow, understanding that this exchange represented something beyond mere friendliness. It was an acknowledgement of shared humanity in the face of unimaginable destruction. On August 15th, when Emperor Hirohito's surrender announcement reached Camp Livingston, the prisoners received the news with complex emotions. Relief that the killing would stop mingled with grief for their nation's defeat and anxiety about what awaited them upon repatriation. Many feared they would be rejected by families who had been told that surrender was unforgivable dishonor. That evening, as the camp processed the reality that the war had ended, Captain Harrison made an unprecedented decision. The fence separating the recreation areas would be temporarily opened, allowing prisoners and guards to gather in a single space for a shared meal. Photographs that had passed back and forth through wire could now be shown directly, hand to hand, in a gesture of reconciliation that anticipated by decades of formal healing between their nations. As dusk fell over Louisiana, men who had been enemies sat together at long tables, their family photographs spread between them like bridges across an uncrossable chasm. They spoke in fragments of shared language, through gestures and expressions, through the universal grammar of pointing to children's faces with pride or tracing the outlines of hometown landscapes with nostalgia. Private Tanaka found himself seated across from Miller, their photographs mingled on the table between them. The American son and Tanaka's daughter seemed to gaze at each other across the divide of paper and time, their innocence a rebuke to the conflict that had separated their fathers. "What will you tell her?" Miller asked quietly.
About us, about America, when you go home. Tanaka considered the question, its complexity, its importance. Truth, he finally said, that men can be enemies in war, friends in peace. That photographs, he struggled for the English words, photographs show what is same, not different. Miller nodded, understanding. My boy too. I'll tell him about you, about all of you, that you kept your daughter's picture close, just like I kept his. Around them, similar conversations unfolded, tentative yet profound. Lieutenant Nakamura and Captain Harrison discussed literature. Hemingway and Faulkner, yes, but also Soseki and Kawabata. Corporal Matsutada showed Sergeant Thompson how to fold an origami crane, a symbol of peace and healing, using the same careful hands that had once loaded artillery against American positions. None of these moments could erase what had happened. The brutality of Bataan, the horror of Okinawa, the atomic devastation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
But in this small corner of Louisiana, as summer stars appeared above the camp, something remarkable had taken root. Through the simple act of sharing photographs, enemies had recognized one another as men, incomplete and fallible, yet bound by common hopes and griefs. Years later, long after Camp Livingston had been dismantled and its inhabitants scattered to their respective nations, Takashi Matsumoto, once Private Tanaka, would stand before his daughter in Tokyo, a teenager who had survived the firebombings and grown up without him. He would hold out a creased photograph, not of himself or their family, but of a young American guard named Miller and his son. "This," he would tell her, "is the enemy I was taught to hate. This is the man who shared his bread with me, who showed me his son's face when I showed him yours."
This is the human being behind the word American. His daughter would stare at the unfamiliar faces, struggling to reconcile them with the stories of demons she had been raised on during the war years. "But they bombed us," she would say, confusion in her voice. "They destroyed our cities." "Yes," Matsumoto would acknowledge, "and we attacked them first. We committed terrible acts in China, in the Philippines. War makes monsters of everyone." He would pause, searching for words to convey what he had learned. But the photographs showed us something propaganda could not hide. That before we were soldiers, we were fathers, sons, brothers. That what we fought to protect was the same, even if we fought on opposite sides. Across the Pacific, James Miller would have a similar conversation with his son, now a young man considering military service during Cold War tensions. He would share a worn photograph of Private Tanaka, explaining how this enemy had wept over his daughter's picture, had learned English phrases to ask about Miller's family, had folded paper cranes for peace when the war ended. "Remember this," Miller would tell his son, "when they try to convince you that Russians or Chinese or anyone else are just faceless enemies. Remember that somewhere they're showing their children photographs too. They're pointing to faces they love, places they call home. The photograph doesn't lie, even when everything else does." These conversations would multiply across both nations as former prisoners and guards carried home not just memories of captivity, but glimpses of recognition that had transcended barbed wire and propaganda. Small seeds planted in the unlikely soil of a prison camp, growing slowly into something neither government had anticipated, a stubborn resistance to dehumanization, rooted in the remembered exchange of paper images across enemy lines. Perhaps it was not enough to prevent future conflicts. Perhaps the machinery of nationalism and fear would continue to divide humanity into us and them again and again. But for those who had experienced it, the power of a photograph to pierce the carefully constructed barriers between enemies remained undeniable. It offered a quiet testament to the possibility that even in our darkest moments, recognition of shared humanity might flicker to life in the most unexpected places, passed hand to hand like a fragile flame that refuses to be extinguished. And so, as you consider the forgotten corners of history, the small human moments that official records rarely capture, remember the guards and prisoners of Camp Livingston, men who discovered, through creased and treasured photographs, that the lines dividing us are often thinner than we imagine, Remember how easily they can dissolve when we glimpse, even briefly, the familiar loves and losses reflected in the eyes of those we have been taught to fear.